Good morning once again. It's your old pal, Dr. Plague, back around the fire with more cozy horror for your listening pleasure. Today's topic of discussion is a little bit vague. It's that feeling of unsafety, that feeling of being in a safe place, but knowing you aren't really safe. It's the violation of our safe places, our sanctity, our strongholds. And that's something that we're going to look at here today on Cozy Horror. So let's start out strong with a story about a man who goes to a rental cabin to get away from it all so he can write his book and feel safe while he does it. Let's hear a story about the hollow clatter of chime. I sipped my coffee and stared at the half-finished page in the mouth of my old Underwood. 3 days. 3 days, and this was what I had to show for it. I put my head in my hands and leaned back in the squeaky old office chair that had been here when I arrived. I couldn't get my mind on my work today, and that was a big problem. I'd rented the cabin for 2 weeks. 2 weeks of bliss away from screaming children and honey-do lists. And now I was 3 days deep with nothing to show for it but 3 paragraphs and writer's block. Smooth jazz caressed me from the speakers of my little CD player. But today, its chords might have well have been breaking glass. The wind blew outside, kicking up leaves against that glass, and as the jazz played on, I heard it again. There was something else under the surface of that jangling wind, the rattling sound that had been breaking my concentration for the last 3 days. A maddening, almost skeletal sound that wouldn't stop. I turned back to my work, but within minutes, I had stopped again. The story was supposed to be about... What the hell was the story supposed to be about again? A horror writer in the woods, or something cliche like that. It had all seemed so well put together when I'd driven up here 3 days ago. A writer in the woods, writing his story, while something supernatural lurks around him, making his stories come to life. I tapped absent-mindedly at the keys for a few more minutes before I growled and yanked the paper out of the Underwood, throwing it in the garbage can. The Underwood was a vanity, and I knew it. I own 3 computers, one of them a very nice and very expensive MacBook. But I used the Underwood because it made me feel like a professional. Someone had told me at a convention or a book signing or something that real writers use typewriters. So I went out and paid an excessive amount of money for this ancient engine of destruction. It took a lot of money to keep this golem up and running, too, but I paid it, toting this heavy thing around in a case that was half as expensive as it had been, and felt that my writing was better for it. It would not have shocked me to learn that many writers had similar totems. The wind scuttled through the trees again, and this time I jumped when the leaves spattered against the window. It sounded like someone throwing a fistful of rocks against the glass, but that wasn't what had surprised me. I had been listening for that clattering sound, the almost musical knocking that sounded so familiar, and the sound of the skeletal leaves had caught me off guard. I cursed as I pulled the half-started sheet and threw it away. I had laid across the keyboard in my panic, and now it was ruined. I drew another sheet down into the guts of the old contraption and began to write again, getting a little further this time as I sipped my coffee, becoming quite happy with the results. The mountain path ran up and up and up as he scaled the climb and made his way to the cabin near the top. The snow lay like delicate lace upon the ground, and the tires of his Dodge Charger crunched into the snow as I stopped. A Charger? The rider hadn't had a Charger in the other ridings I'd done. The Charger was mine, a big black brute that now hunkered outside the cabin as I wasted time inside. What was the rider driving again? He couldn't have gotten a Charger up here in the snow anyway. The car was great for highways and gravel roads, but snow and hills would have left it parked and waiting for more favorable conditions. I considered leaving it, but it just wouldn't do. I dragged out the correction tape and changed it to Jeep instead. Still, I wish the rider could experience the bliss of owning something I had wanted since I was a kid. The car out front had been a present, a reward for good service, which hadn't stopped my wife from complaining about it. Really, a muscle car? That's so like you, Derek. Leave it to you to publish a book and have a midlife crisis all in the same week. She didn't get it, though. This had been a reward when my first novel had sold 500,000 copies. I'd paid cash for it on the lot and felt like somewhere in my past, a 12-year-old version of myself was grinning and pumping his fist. My old man had wanted a Charger, had talked longingly about getting one any time he saw one, but he had been a welder for a rinky-dink construction outfit and had disdained books almost as much as he disdained his poof of a son for writing them. Well, now Dad was in the ground, and look who was screaming down the road in a Charger. I changed my mind again. The car stayed, and changed it again before moving on. Pulled his bags from the car and walked to the cabin. 2 weeks of peace and quiet to finish his book. 2 weeks of just him and his old typewriter in the picturesque cabin. Going up had been an adventure, but going down again would be suicide, and he only meant to tempt fate once. For better or worse, he was up here for 2 weeks. He had enough food, smokes, whiskey, and toilet paper for 14 days, and if it ran out, then he supposed he would just have to do without. His editor said his new book had to be ready before October, or he might as well shelve it forever, and he meant to have it ready. I nodded as I took the sheet off the typewriter, liking where this was going. The writer was at the cabin now. That was a start. Now I just had to get the rest of it. I wished my editor had told me I only had 2 weeks to write my latest mediocre piece of trash. My editor was a nice guy, but he was definitely more than a little spineless. He was more than willing to wheedle and kiss ass when what I really needed was a good boot in the backside. A deadline or an ultimatum might have motivated me more than what I actually had going on. It hadn't been a deadline, but due dates that pushed me to get to work on the book. The car was paid off, but the house was still a work in progress. Money from my first book was also beginning to run dry. The cabin had been an expense that I didn't really have, but if it birthed another book, then I suppose it was worth it. The wind hit the side of the house again, and I heard those unsettling wind chimes bang together for the 1,000th time. I couldn't figure out where they were. I hadn't seen any wind chimes when I came in, or I would have taken them down after the first night. At first they'd been a little interesting, but as time passed, they became downright grating. They were different from any wind chimes I'd ever heard. It didn't sound like metal, but it didn't sound like wood either. It sounded hollow, kind of like the leaves that kept rattling against the glass. The first night they had woken me up more than once. When I did sleep, it had come into my dreams, and the dreams would have made a good book all their own. Someone knocked, and I jerked a little as I went to see who it was. I was honestly a little glad for the distraction, ready to chalk this whole thing up as a wash the longer it went on.
Seemed like I was honestly just looking for a reason to take a break, and I worried I wouldn't have anything to prop up the cost of this trip. My wife was going to have a fit, very likely, but I think the bigger disappointment would be that I didn't have a book for her to proofread. Melina had loved Feist, my first book, and it had held us together through some of the rougher times. She, not my editor, had pushed me to finish it, and I'd seen her read the battered old hard copy I'd gotten for Christmas a lot during our marriage. That was why I had to finish this one so desperately. I needed to remind her that I could still be the man that she had fallen in love with. The man on the other side of the door seemed relieved when he saw me, and I opened it with what I hoped was a friendly greeting. James had been hesitant to rent me the cabin, despite the good weather we'd been having, and it had taken a little coaxing to get the story out of him. We'd been corresponding for a month before he let me make a reservation, and the first night here, after a couple of handles of good whiskey, he had told me the reason. It appeared I wasn't the only one who had rented the place to get some work done, and the last guy had left him holding the bag in more ways than one. I came to check on him pretty regular, but one day, he just wasn't here. His truck was here, his stuff was here, but he was just gone. They never found him, but I keep looking for him when I go on my hikes sometimes. He didn't seem to like the sound of the weird wind chimes either, and he couldn't tell me what the sound was. "Hey," he said, his smile only slightly worried. "Just coming to make sure you didn't need anything. I brought some wood, too. They say there might be a blow-up tonight, and I didn't want you to freeze up here." I looked outside, craning my neck as if I expected to see the words "snow" written in the sky by some huge hand. "In September?" I asked, thinking he must be joking. He shrugged. "It happens some years. The weather here is temperamental, so do you need anything?" I shook my head. "I think I'm all set. I've got enough supplies for a month at least." That had been by design. Once I came up here, I didn't want to do anything but write and sleep and exist. Clearly I was making a botch of one of those things, but this guy didn't need to know about that. He nodded. "Well, if you need anything, let me know. I've got an old snowmobile if you get stuck up here, but I don't think it'll be that bad. Your car looks heavy enough to make it down, even if it snowed a foot of powder." I nodded, resisting the urge to tell him it was a Charger, and we parted ways. I gave it another half hour in front of the Underwood before shaking my head and going to get the whiskey I'd brought with me. Sometimes great writing needed a little lubricant. All the great writers knew that. That was why most of them had been drunks. A couple of handles in, and I was ready to write. I got back to work as the sun set behind the smeary windows. As I walked the writer through the setting up, I must have hit a hard head of steam because I started really banging it out as afternoon stretched into evening. I had a couple more glasses of whiskey, and as the paper got harder and harder to see, I found the pages were stacking up. The rattling kept right on coming, but I was too drunk to care. The juices were flowing, and when I slipped sideways halfway into my 6th or 7th glass, I saw something hitting the window as I passed out. They were small, the white flakes looking very wet as they slapped against the glass, and I slid sideways. They were small, the white flakes looking very wet as they slapped against the glass and slid sideways. I hadn't really had a lot of experience with snow, but I remembered something like this from when I was a kid. The snow hadn't stuck, but I had laid in bed watching it hit the window as my nightlight had thrown soft light across the glass. I lay there in a stupor and remembered that, and when the wind chimes came again, hollow and ethereal, I remembered something else. I remembered watching something on TV, a 5-tet of dancing skeletons as they wiggled and wobbled in the autumn air. Somehow I imagined that the sound I heard would be like that. The sound of hollow bones banging against each other would make a sound like that. But the more I tried to fix on it, the foggier the dreams became. Finally, as my drunken dreams usually did, I was suddenly awake, and I'd traveled through time to a new place and a new win. I was shivering on the floor of the cabin, the inside suddenly very chilly, and the snow against the windows making the insides shadowy. It was sometime in the mid-morning, after dawn but before lunch, and the drift was up to the lip of the windowsill. I guess it had been more than a few inches, and as I staggered to my feet, I looked out and saw that my charger was covered in snow up to the door handles. Jesus, it had just dumped 3 feet overnight. Luckily, I had wood and bottled water, so I got myself a drink to cut the sharp edge of my hangover and got the fire going in the fireplace. As the snow rattled against the window and the hollow chimes continued to clang together, I sat down to look over what I had written. For drunken ramblings, it was pretty good. They were almost on topic, too, all of them laying out the strange sound that kept assaulting the writer as he worked. Wasn't the direction I'd intended to go, but I liked what my drunken self had put together so far. He sat at the keys, fingers ready for battle, but as they went to work, he heard the sound of it as it scraped across his nerves. It was a hollow clunking, the sound of old plastic bottles falling downstairs. And as the wind outside pushed at the house incessantly, the sound continued. It was a mystery at first, something he chased, but soon it would become maddening. That was pretty good, I reflected. The writer went looking for the sound, but couldn't seem to find anything. There were no chimes on the porch, front or back, and there were none hanging from the eaves. He checked the ragged trees around the house and even looked under the porch, but he couldn't find anything. There were no wind chimes anywhere. And that was when he noticed the window. Window? I said, flipping the page. What window? This story had taken a turn I hadn't planned on. But now he was talking about windows. The cabin he was in was supposed to be a single story. No upstairs to have a window. Of course, I hadn't meant to give the guy a charger either, and now he had one. The story was taking on a mystery feel, and I found that I liked it. I sat back down to write, feeding more paper in, but as I clicked away at the keys, I found that the threads just wouldn't come. It wasn't the story I had in mind, and now it was going off into uncharted waters. I tore a few pages out and tossed them, grunting as the light cut into my vision, and by noon I was looking at the half-empty bottle again. Maybe a little of the old inspiration could be found in its depths. 3 shots later, and I was off again. The window was important. There was someone in the window. He could see them, but he didn't know how to get there. There were no stairs, no way for anyone to get up there, so how were they there? I took another shot and kept writing. Suddenly, the cabin I was in and the cabin I was writing about were one and the same. There was a stranger in the cabin, someone lurking in the walls, and the writer felt like if he didn't find them, then they would surely drive him crazy. They were the ones making the noise. They were responsible for the hollow chimes, and if he wanted to keep his sanity, then the writer needed to find them. I passed out again that night, waking up in the morning with an even nastier hangover and about 20 pages of new material. I could get used to this whole getting drunk and waking up with pages deal. The writer had continued his own book, a book within a book, but his mind kept wandering to that person in the upper story. He had called the realtor. he had rented the place from, but the man had assured him that the window was aesthetic. There was nothing up there. The writer didn't believe him, and reflected on a story the man had told him about another writer who had gone missing in the house, a writer who had gone missing under mysterious circumstances. He'd been working on his novel, a long mystery that he seemed to be making progress on, when he suddenly vanished. His truck was there, his things were there, but he was gone. I searched for him, but there was no sign. He kept a journal, and the journal talked a lot about strange sounds that he had heard when the wind blew. It was the rattling, hollow clatter of chimes, and the writer became quite mad. The realtor said this, and he had found holes in the walls where the man had gone searching for them, and he had charged the man's estate for the damages in his absence. I hoped the guy who had rented me the cabin wouldn't mind that I borrowed his story, but it was really coming along now. I had some idea where it was going, and one look outside told me I wasn't going anywhere. The snow was up to the porch now, and I had to force the door open to go check on a theory. As the house in the story became the house I was staying in, at least in my mind, I wanted to see if there was a window out there. Maybe I was working elements of real life into my tale, and as I tromped through the snow, I was a little relieved to see that there was no window over the porch. The roof rose into a upside-down V, and though there might be an attic up there somewhere, it wasn't big enough for a room. I started to go back inside, but something told me to walk around a little bit. I'd made a full circuit of the house and was heading back to the front porch when my foot came down on something and sent me sprawling. It had been small and slippery, the object rolling out treacherously as I turned, and as I lay there in the snow, I looked up and found the window. It was round, not a bay window like I had talked about in the story, and as I squinted, I thought I could see something up there. It was subtle, a dark outline, but it was definitely person-shaped. I reached down into the snow to see if I could find what I had slipped on, and came up with a cracked but still intact shot glass. The idea that I had come out here before the snow was very deep seemed to make sense. I'd come out here while I was drunk and looked at this window, and that was why it had stuck so fast in my mind. I'd seen it, seen the person-shaped shadow, and my mind had started running. It had been like that with Feist, too. I had seen something, a little dog hunting ground squirrels one afternoon, and my mind had raced along like one of those little squirrels. I spent the next 3 days writing, drinking, and nursing my pounding head in the morning. By the end of the first week, I had my story, but not my ending. The snow didn't melt, but it didn't grow any faster after that night. It froze into a tightly packed little hillock, and my expedition outside was very chilly. I could have driven through them if I had needed to get out, but going down the mountain with 3 feet of snow on the ground would have been close to suicide. The radio had said the snow would melt before it was time to leave, so I took it as a sign to just keep writing. The writer, my writer, had found the journal of the writer that had gone missing. It was hidden behind some books in the reading nook, and he had immersed himself in the man's ramblings. The writer was being slowly driven crazy by the sound of the wind chimes, but he believed that they were talking to him as well. They wanted to be found. They wanted to tell him a great secret. And as he searched for the secrets of the cabin, so did I. I started looking for a way into the attic. It had to be somewhere, but the house was devoid of any of the usual loft entrances I was used to seeing. There were no ceiling entrances, no pull-down ladders, And as my time began to wane, I thought of something I hadn't. Taking a leaf from the Scooby-Doo notebook, I started looking for secret entrances. The book had ground to a halt, the writer stuck trying to find his own way into the secret room, but I figured once I discovered the source of the wind chimes, I would have my ending too. I was starting to consider making some holes in the wall myself when I noticed something I should have right away. By the reading nook, there was a portion of the ceiling that was curved. It curved up, the rest of the ceiling being mostly flat, but it was enough to notice that this would be the most obvious place for a stairwell. I started moving the bookcase, sliding them to the side as I looked for the source, and was rewarded with a doorway. It was so seamless that I could believe that no one had found it. Maybe even the guy who had rented it before me had known about it, though that seemed like a stretch. The doorway squalled on rusty hinges as it came open, and I took the stairs slowly and deliberately. If someone was up there, then they would have surely heard me. But I suppose they already knew I was down there. As I came to the top, I froze as the person shape came into view. They were standing about a foot from the window, just staring in the direction of the muted light. And the longer I looked, the more I realized they weren't standing. The person would have had a hard time standing, especially in their condition. They moved ever so slightly as the wind came in through the eaves, and as it did, I heard the hollow sound of the chimes. They swayed to and fro, their bones held together with the thinnest of tendons, and some of the bones on the ground showed that they had been falling apart as time went by. I closed the hatch and called the man who had rented the cabin to me. I had to let him know that I had found the writer. Turned out I would be leaving on time, but I'd have to finish the book at home. The police had a lot of questions, as did the guy I rented the cabin from. For starters, he was unaware that the place had an attic. He had inherited it from his uncle and had done little but rent it out for the last 5 years. When the guy had disappeared in it last year, he had just assumed he had wandered off in the woods, but it appeared that the writer had discovered the secret passage and how to close it behind himself. They had found the writer's screenplay in the attic, along with his body, the body that I had been hearing all this time. He was little more than forearms, leg bones, and rib cage now, but his body had deteriorated until his bones were being held together by the thinnest of cartilage and skin. No one knew why he had decided to hang himself up there. He hadn't left a journal like the missing writer in my story, but he had a history of antidepressants and mental health issues. The owner of the cabin said he was glad to have finally found him, but I think I'll end my book a little differently. Even as I drive down the mountain, I can see the ending of the book coming together. The writer discovers a secret room where the realtor hides the bodies of the writers whose stories he steals, and the writer manages to fight him off before he becomes his last victim. Should be a good ending and a great story for the book circuit after I publish it. It isn't every day that you get to be part of a real-life mystery, after all.
Sometimes it makes me question what I might find in the attic of the old Motel 6. Let's move on to another story. A story about a comfort object from one's childhood that perhaps hides something a little darker, something a little hungry. Let's hear a story about Dream Eater.
Michelle huffed angrily as she noticed that her dream catcher had fallen off the ceiling again. She checked under the bed, behind the nightstand, even in the bathroom in case it had rolled inside. Nothing. No dream catcher, no sign of where it had gone. It wasn't as if this was uncommon or anything. Michelle had been replacing dream catchers for most of her life, but the older she got, the more annoying it became. Michelle went to the closet and opened a box labeled Decor, sorting through dozens of dream catchers that she had inside. This just happened sometimes. It had happened since she was young, and she'd gotten used to just replacing them. She picked up a frilly pink one, the leather around the ring dyed to match, but put it back. This one had been a gift, and she didn't want to waste it. She settled on a cheap neon blue one from the gas station and attached it to a hook over her bed. She hated to buy more, but the alternative was worse. The alternative was something that she hadn't experienced since she was very young. Michelle's mother had been fiercely spiritual. Trina Jones had stood out like a sore thumb among the community of strict Baptists and Methodists. Her mother had done a little of this and a little of that to get by, and Michelle had a tumultuous childhood. They lived in a little house that had been owned by her grandmother, and Michelle couldn't remember a time when her grandmother had come to the house for longer than a few minutes. She'd asked her why she never came over once, Michelle spending the night while her mother went to a concert with some friends. She and her grandmother had been shelling peas on the porch of Grandma's house, just on the other side of the block, and her grandmother's scowl had been hard to miss at the time. "I hate to see what your mother's done to that house. It offends my senses, but God forgive me, I won't cast her out. She's free to live her life however she likes, but that doesn't mean I have to let her rub it in my face." Her mother had an odd hodgepodge of beliefs, and Michelle could remember all of them jostling together in the living room of their small house. Trina, though her grandmother had always called her Grace, was an old hippie, and she had been taken with paganism and druidic ideas as she followed her friends on the road before Michelle was born. She had also liked the ideas of Buddhism, Taoism, and several other Eastern spiritualities. As such, the living room was often crowded with altars, statues, and other paraphernalia for whatever ritual or rite her mother was working on. The dream catchers were a part of it. Michelle had always suffered from terrible nightmares, and her mother had hung the dream catchers over her bed since she was very young. Her mother had also noticed the rate at which the dream catchers disappeared, but if she knew why, she never said. To Michelle, it was always just a fun mystery that never seemed to have an answer, like where the socks went when you lost them in the dryer. Michelle hung the new dream catcher over her bed and got back to getting ready for work. She had bills to pay and, inevitably, more dream catchers to buy. She found herself thinking back to the mystery of where all the dream catchers went as her workday slowed down. She tried to puzzle out where they might be disappearing to, but ultimately came up with nothing. As a kid, she had tried everything. She had nailed them to the ceiling. She had set up little nets to catch them if they fell. She had gone so far as to set up a little camera one night to see if someone was taking them. But the recordings had stopped at 11 when it ran out of tape. She hadn't really thought about it in a long time, but the more she pondered it, the more curious she became. She made a mental note to set up her phone camera tonight and see if she could find out what was taking them. The phone wouldn't run out of tape, unlike her video camera, and maybe she could figure out what was going on. 4 nights later, and 3 deleted 8-hour recordings later, Michelle woke up to find her phone knocked over and her neon blue dream catcher missing. The video that she scrolled through that day at lunch was less than helpful. The phone had recorded the dream catcher until about 2 a.m., seeing nothing but the dust motes and the circles of feathers on the strings that hung from the ceiling. Then, at 2:07, Michelle heard a soft sound like a latch being slid, and the window had whispered open. A shadow passed over the camera, which was knocked over a few seconds later. No matter how many times she rewound the footage, Michelle couldn't tell what had knocked the camera over. It recorded nothing else but darkness for the rest of the night, until she had picked it up in the morning and turned it off. That gave her something new to worry about. Who was stealing her dream catchers, and why? Surely it couldn't be the same person all these years. She'd been losing dream catchers since she was 3 years old. She had moved 2 states away from her childhood home and moved into 3 different dorm rooms before settling into this apartment. It couldn't be the same person. But then, who was it? As she sat in traffic that day, she felt moved to call her mother, and as she dialed the number, she felt silly. What did she think her mother was going to do about it? Her mother had been a rolling stone ever since Michelle had left home 3 years ago, and the notion that she'd even be reachable was laughable. Trina had been the big push for her to accept the offer from Tennessee State College. She'd set her daughter down, pulling her away from her studies as she tried not to bomb her final and lose her acceptance letter. She told her that she'd been sent a spiritual vision and that it was time for her to travel. This vision didn't have anything to do with her latest man, Beau, and had everything to do with her wanderlust needing to be satiated. I'll stick around long enough for you to graduate, but after that, I'm hitting the road and giving the keys back to your grandmother. Michelle hadn't talked to her much in those 3 years, but she thought she might have some insight in this. She picked up on the fourth ring, and Michelle could hear soft guitar music and the sounds of laughter in the background. "Hey, sweetie, what's the occasion? I haven't heard from you in months." I need to talk to you about something. I'm a little scared, and it's kind of important." Michelle heard the sound quiet as her mother walked away or stepped into someplace. "What's wrong, Micah? You need a reading or some crystal healing? I can send you some vibrations to the phone if you..." But Michelle cut her off before she could get going. If she let Trina get rolling, they'd be on the phone all night. "I need to know about the dream catchers. Why did they go missing?" There was a long pause, and Michelle was worried that she had lost her. "Mom, are you still hanging them?" she asked. And it wasn't the voice she was used to hearing from her mother. It was low and scared, at odds with her mother's usual gregarious nature. "Of course, but I've been thinking a lot about them lately, and I just..." "Don't stop hanging them, Michelle. I know it's a pain, but trust me, they help. But why do I..." "Just..." She paused as she got control of herself again. "Just keep hanging them. If you need more, I'll send you some. I know a guy out there who makes them, and he owes me a favor. I'll get you some in bulk, but please, just hang them. And stay safe." "Safe from what?" Michelle asked, getting frustrated. Her mother had never been this serious, and it scared her more than the video had. Her mother clearly knew something, but she wouldn't tell her. She had never been good at keeping secrets, and Michelle didn't understand why she wanted to start now. I gotta go. Just..." She seemed to gather her thoughts as she tried to find a way to explain. "Just keep hanging them, and stay safe. I love you, Michelle. I'll send you some dream catchers soon so you don't run out." Then she hung up on her, and Michelle was left confused and agitated. She thought about what her mother had told her for the rest of the night. The way she had acted scared Michelle, and the transition from her mother's nickname to her real name had made it all the more jarring. Her mother had started calling her Micah when she was a kid, thinking it sounded more earthy, and Michelle hadn't heard her use her real name in quite a while. She had started to hang a new dream catcher, but paused midway through trying to hook it up there. The more she thought about it, the more she saw no reason to hang a new one. She'd had bad dreams when she was younger, but it was something that she hadn't experienced in a long time. Who's to say that the dream catchers had done anything? She froze there, unsure whether to proceed, and finally, she just tossed the dream catcher onto the nightstand. She'd sleep without it tonight and see what happened. Worst case scenario, she had a bad dream that night and would wake up and put a new one up. It took some time to get to sleep, but Michelle was sure that tonight would be as fine as all the others before it. When she woke up midway through the night, she was glad. The dream she'd been having was terrifying, but it was nothing compared to what she had woken up to. Her dreams had been incredibly dark. She had woken up in a hellscape, the sky constantly burning as the rain came down in runners of flames. She was lying naked on the hard stone, her body pulled close as she shuddered. All around her there were creatures gathering, their growls like thunder. She closed her eyes, trying to wake up, but it just never seemed to happen. She was stuck, waiting for these creatures to come in on her, and as the first lunged at her, its bony mouth snapping, she came awake like a deep sea diver from the depths. She thought for a moment that she was still sleeping, until she felt the pressure in her ear. She had never felt anything so intimate, so violating, and the feeling made her shudder in utter terror. She swiveled her gaze to the left and saw something large and pale crouching beside the bed. It looked like a giant white bug, its body pale and wrinkled. It was hunkered below the side of the bed, like a kid wanting to ask a question. Its bald head gleamed in the moonlight, and Michelle realized that her window was open again. The long red tongue that slid over the edge of the bed and into her ear was as hard to miss as the pale horror kneeling there. The tongue bulged her eardrum, making her head feel far fuller than she was used to. It felt like it might be going all the way to her brain. What was he doing? Was he trying to eat her? What was going on? The tongue slid soupily out of her ear as his piss-yellow eyes grew large. He had noticed that she was awake. As it reached its full height, Michelle realized how big it was. 7 feet tall, each arm tipped with 6 long claws. As it loomed over her, Michelle worried that it would finish what it had started. Its long tongue slid over its thin lips, and they turned up at the corners as it took her in. "Don't worry," it whispered, its voice high and waspish. "I need you alive so I can continue to feed. I must admit, it's nice to get a taste from the source again. I usually get your tasty floating snacks, but today I got a real treat from the old country." Its tongue slid over its lips again, its face a rapture as it remembered the flavor. It climbed out of her window, its body groaning as its bones leaned into the twists. But Michelle felt utterly paralyzed. She didn't understand what was going on. What in the world was that? Had that been what her mother had been trying to protect her from? Had she known about it? Why hadn't she just told her? Michelle pulled her knees to her chest, the terror sending shudders up her frame, and as the birds began to chirp and the sun sent pink fingers over the edge of her window, she finally reached for her phone. Her mother sounded sleepy when she picked up, but it sounded like she might have been expecting the call. "So, you saw it, then?" Michelle couldn't answer right away, managing only a small grunt of acknowledgement. "Did it hurt you? It never did when you were a kid, but you knew it would come after me then?" It wasn't a question. When you were young, you started having night terrors. You would wake me up every night with the most terrible screaming, and I didn't know what to do. Worse than that, you drew pictures of the dreams the next day. Flaming skies, terrible creatures, just the bleakest places imaginable. I didn't know what to do. One night I woke up before you started screaming and felt like I needed to go make sure you were okay. That was when I saw it. He was leaning down over you, his tongue coming out of your ear, and he seemed to be drinking something out of your head. He ran when he saw me, bending out of the window like a serpent, and that only deepened my confusion. That was when I tried the dream catchers. It was on a whim. I didn't know whether it would work, but when it stopped your night terrors, I thought that maybe it kept him away. When they started disappearing, I figured out what was going on." She stopped, collecting her thoughts, and Michelle could hear the sounds of crickets making music in the background. Wherever she was, it was someplace green. Michelle could almost see the trees and feel the breeze, and she suddenly wished that she was with her. Was this why Mom had traveled so much? Was she running from something too? Michelle suddenly realized how little she knew about her mother, and wished that she had taken the time to learn more. The dream catchers don't do anything besides what they're supposed to. They take your dreams and store them inside those strings. Whatever these things are, and I mean things because I don't believe there's just one of them. They like eating your nightmares. The dream catchers distract them, give them something to eat instead. That's why you need to keep hanging them. Michelle wanted to ask more, wanted to know if her mom had any idea about the places she saw in her dreams, but instead, she just reached for the dream catcher on her nightstand. I'll be in touch," Michelle whispered, hanging up as she stood on the bed to attach it to the ceiling. She wouldn't feel safe again until it was back in place. In truth, Michelle wondered if she'd ever feel safe again.
It's always odd the histories that our favorite items might hold. Our next story takes us to a place of refuge, a watering hole, a bar where we drink ourselves into oblivion and feel safe as houses while doing it. Because of course, we always wind up back home, except for the times we wind up in the drunk tank. But sometimes the monsters are just waiting for us to lose a little bit of control. Let's hear a story about a dangerous smile.
It all started with a trip to the bar. Some friends had invited me out after work for drinks. Given that we all work at the steel mill in this 2-stoplight rural town, that meant we were going to Dusty's. Dusty's is what's colloquially called a dive bar, but it's the only bar we have in town. It's a little roadhouse where you can drink watered-down beer, listen to country music, put some money in the jukebox, play some pool, or hit on the 7 or 8 half-dead barflies that are there every night. If you go to Dusty's for the atmosphere, then you're going to be disappointed. Most of us went there to watch the guys who worked for the town's only other reliable business, the logging company, drink too much and get in fights with people that are unprepared to stand toe-to-toe with them. That night in question was what you would call a slow night. I'd had about 3 pitchers of cheap beer, and the only fight we had seen was when someone's wife came in to drag him away from whatever tart he was talking to by the stage. Neither of them had been particularly skillful brawlers, and when they finally decided to just beat the crap out of her husband and drag him out of the parking lot, I told the guys I was going to turn in early. It was creeping up on midnight, and the bar was deader than usual. Dude, no way you're going to get a cab this late at night. You might as well stick around. Why wouldn't I be able to get a cab? Sandy's runs till 3 in the morning most nights. Charlie, the guy who had told me I wouldn't get a cab, leaned back on his stool so he could look at me. My cousin Dwayne says the cabs won't come out this far after 10 o'clock. They've been having trouble with people going missing. I rolled my eyes, walking my stool back so I didn't fall off of it. I was drunker than I thought I had been, and I didn't want to fall over in front of my friends. Yeah, I've been hearing those stories since I was a kid. Tell your cousin not to believe everything he reads on the internet. I took a staggering step towards the door, catching the bar with my hand as the room spun a little. Nah, Charlie protested. This is pretty recent. They say that the cabs have been arriving to pick up fares, but when they get there, no one is waiting. It's a big mystery, and no one's really sure what to think of it. I scoffed at him, not really in the mood for any of that. I staggered out of Dusty's, taking out my cell phone as I tried to Google the number for Sandy's. I'd used it often enough that you'd think I could remember it, but in my current state, I couldn't remember much of anything. After 2 or 3 failed attempts, I managed to get the number in and got the receptionist after 3 long rings. Sandy's Cabs, how can I help you? Yeah, I need to get a cab from Dusty's bar. I'd heard the clicking of keys on the other end of the phone, but when she learned my location, she seemed to change her mind. I'm sorry, sir, we don't pick up from Dusty's anymore. I glowered at the phone, not quite sure I had heard her right. What kind of small-town cab company doesn't pick up from the biggest bar in town? How come? I asked. It was deemed too detrimental to our clients. I guess Charlie had been right. Okay, well, where can I catch a cab? There was some furious clicking, and when she came back, she almost seemed to be whispering, as if something might hear her. There's a bus stop down by Richmond. The company has said that it's the closest to Dusty's that will pick up clients. Richmond? It's almost 5 blocks from here. Sorry, sir. If you want a cab, then that's where you'll have to go. I considered just going back inside to wait for the others, but decided I was ready to leave. A walk would probably do me some good anyway. Fine. I'll meet them there in 30 minutes. The dispatcher said that she would dispatch a cab, and then promptly hung up on me. With that out of the way, I began my walk along the shoulder of the rural road. Fortunately, the weather was pretty good for early June. The pine trees on the left side of the road side I was walking on, made a skittering sound in the wind, and it sent a chill down my spine. The thick swab of pulpwood trees seemed to stretch on for miles, and the farther I walked, the more it felt like something was watching me. It was little more than a tickle on the side of my face, the slight attention of something that I couldn't really see, but the farther I went, the more the regard rankled me. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just feeling creeped out after a long walk in the middle of the night, but I heard the pine needles crunching lightly beneath something and decided to speed up. I tried to convince myself it was just a deer or a fox that I had disturbed up, and it would leave off after it got a sniff of me. They were more afraid of me than I was of them, and once they realized it, they'd take off. The farther I walked, though, the more I thought about the disappearance that Charlie had talked about. I wasn't much for news. I didn't even have a cable subscription, but I was shocked that I hadn't heard anything about these kidnappings or whatever they were. The thought that there might be something watching me from the woods with intentions of making me its next victim made me speed up a little more. I had to stop myself from running as I ate up the road. What would I do when I got to the bus stop if there was no cab there? Would I really be able to just sit in the terminal and wait while whatever was out there kept watching me? I shook the feeling off, feeling silly. It's just a raccoon or a possum or something. Just because it seemed to be going in the same direction I was didn't necessarily mean it had ill intentions. I tried to ignore the soft sound of indignant pine needles as they broke underfoot, but the farther we went, the harder it became. It was just an animal, I told myself. I had just disturbed it in whatever had brought it out tonight, and now it was curious of me. It would go on its way soon. It would leave me alone if I just ignored it. I kept telling myself that, but the further I went, the harder it was to believe. It seemed to be stalking me from behind the dark forest, a predator intent on man-flesh. It looked like some kind of hunting cat, its head boxy and its body sleek and long. It slunk quietly along behind me, plotting its attack as it prepared to spring. That was stupid, I told myself. There was nothing there. I was just making myself paranoid. I was imagining the sound of large, flat paws on pine falls. I was creating the slightly elevated breathing of the animal. If I turned now, I wouldn't see anything but the shadows and the pine trees. I tried to make my head turn, but my neck seemed unwilling. I remembered something that my grandma had said once when I was a kid, and her voice rustled through my mind like a ghost. Some things don't like being seen, and when you see them, you can't take it back. When I saw the lights of the bus stop, I almost broke into a run. I made myself walk, however, because things like that love to chase, too. As I got closer to the bus stop, I became aware of someone sitting in the lighted shell. As I got closer, I could see it was a woman, her head down and her body abnormally still. I wanted to call out to her to warn her about the thing that was following me, but as I moved closer to the stop, I realized it had broken off its chase at some point. I breathed a sigh of relief, laughing at myself for psyching myself up. It had all been in my head after all, and I had never really been in any danger. As I came into the light of the bus stop, I almost laughed, my smile hard to hide. "Something funny?" asked the woman, lifting her head to look at me. My smile soured a little. Her voice sounded strange in the bus shell, and I worried that I might have offended her. "No, it's just I was worried about something, and it appears to have all been in my head. I was mostly laughing at myself for being foolish." I realized now that I was here that she was sitting with her knees against her face, and she had leaned her head against her knees as she turned to look at me. She was a stringy thing, older teens or early 20s, and her hair looked oily as it hung about her face like filthy drapes in a rundown trailer. She was dressed in something that had once been a sack or maybe curtains, and I wondered if she might be homeless. Worst of all, she had a smell about her, a smell that was not altogether pleasant, a smell that reminded me of my grandfather's smokehouse after hunting season, of the remains of animals left behind that smokehouse. "What was it?" she asked, her teeth looking too big in her mouth as she smiled. I was afraid of being stalked by some kind of hunting cat," I said, surprising myself by speaking at all. "A cat? In this part of the world?" She scooted a little closer to me, a minute movement, but too much for me. This part of the world is more accustomed to bears, I hear," she said. As she scooted this time, I scooted away. Like I said, it was just a feeling. "What kind of feeling?" she asked, scooting again, though I couldn't figure out how. Her arms were around her legs, her knees against her cheek, and she seemed to have no means of scooting at all. It was, I stuttered, my mouth suddenly very dry. "It was like being Red Riding Hood while the wolf stalked her." At that moment, I was as sober as I had ever been. Between the creature and the girl, all the drink had been burned out of me, and I suddenly wondered if the creature might have left because it smelled her. Her smile threatened to cut her cheeks. "I imagine that was exhilarating. Did you enjoy feeling like the prey for once? Did your blood demand that you run, but your mind insisted that walking would be safer? Did you know how much I wanted to chase you?" My heart was pounding, loud enough for me to hear it. She had just admitted to being the one that was stalking me. She couldn't have been the thing in the woods. There was no way. She had been here when I arrived. There was no way she could have dogged my heels through the woods and then gotten here before me. It was impossible. My brain told me these things, but I found it harder and harder to believe as she slowly backed me into the side of the bus shell. I wanted to run, but I knew that was what she wanted too. "You thought you'd be safe once you made it to the light, didn't you, manling? Little did you know that monsters don't always shrivel in the light." She was very close now, her legs coming down as she unfurled herself. She was bigger than I had thought, her body thin and long as she pulled herself onto the bench. She was on all fours, that grin very disconcerting as it came closer. She was feral looking, some wild woman from the depths of a dark jungle. As she prepared to spring, I saw a pair of headlights pin her to the spot as they approached us. I did run then. I ran from the bench and threw myself into the cab, telling the man to drive before the door was even shut. He looked confused, turning back to the girl as if to ask if she needed a ride too, but his confusion didn't last. The color drained from his face as he got a look at her, and he yelled for me to close the door. He pulled off with a squeal of tires, and we both watched the woman as we drove away, her smiling face getting smaller as she watched us. I leaned against the seat, panting as I tried to control my galloping heart. He had to try a couple of times before I could hear him over the blood pounding in my ears. And when I finally made sense of it, we were turning around to get back on the route. "You got very lucky, fella. More lucky than you know." I asked him why I thought so, and he told me a story I'll never forget. A couple of nights ago, I got a call to that same bus stop to pick up a fare. Dispatch said he sounded weird when he called, like he'd been running, but his car had broke down near the stop, so he figured he had just been pissed off about his luck. I pulled up about 20 minutes later and found not a middle-aged man fuming over his car, but that same girl with the Cheshire Cat grin on her face. She looked up at me as I came to stop, and I just knew that if I got out of my cab, they'd never find me again. The area near Dusty's is supposed to be off limits, and after tonight, I don't think Sandy's will be picking up out here until the situation changes. I've been sitting in my living room, hands shaking as I write this, but unsure of what to do now. I called Charlie before I got into my apartment, but I don't think they really believed me. Charlie was pretty drunk and sounded like he thought I was making fun of him. I hope they make it home safe, but it's that dangerous smile that I can't get out of my mind. She's out there somewhere, waiting for her next victim, and I feel very fortunate to be able to tell you my story and not be a squib in tomorrow's paper.
Makes you think twice before you go down and have a pint, now doesn't it? Our next story is about a man who orders something he believes might be safe. Something benign. A pile of dirt, perhaps. Oh, but the things that come with that pile of dirt are a little more than he expected. So, let's hear a story about a pile of dirt.
I pushed the sign into the ground and looked at the kids gathering up the street with thinly veiled satisfaction. "Keep off the dirt," it read. I'd seen the way their eyes gleam when the truck came to deliver it, deciding on a preemptive strike. A tall pile of fill dirt was irresistible for small children, and I needed as much of the dirt for my project as possible. Having it scattered all over the yard would make that very difficult, and I needed to post signs before the neighborhood rowdies got any ideas. I went back inside then, not wanting to field questions about my dirt. Sitting in my easy chair, pretending to watch TV, I could see them gathering around to look at the sign. They hunkered over their handlebars and looked dubiously at the sign I had stuck in the mountain of dirt in the front yard. The sign was pretty straightforward, but I wouldn't put it past these kids to find a loophole. They knew me as the cool neighbor, the single guy who gave out full-size candy bars on Halloween and sometimes played baseball in the street with them. The guy who drank on his front porch and sometimes let them fish in his canal, if it was okay with their parents, that was. On some things, however, they knew that I was unbending, and it wouldn't do to argue with me. They all looked up when I came out on the front porch and leaned against the rail to look at them. If you're hoping to find a play in the dirt free card somewhere on top of that pile, it ain't happening. Reggie looked up, and his face was still hopeful. "Gee, Mr. McQuinty, that sure is a great-looking pile of dirt you have there." I nodded, keeping my face neutral as I tried not to smile. "Sure is, and it's for filling in gopher holes, so I'll likely need all of it. If there's any left, though, I'll be sure to let you kids know so you can trample it flat for me." They rode off down the road, sitting a little higher on their bikes as they realized they might still get to play in it. I shook my head as I watched them leave. I'd never known anyone to get so excited about a pile of dirt, except maybe for a bunch of kids. Something about all that fresh, powdery dirt just made them go a little bit crazy. As I looked at the 6-foot mound of fine white dirt, I almost felt like jumping on it myself. I went inside to finish my preparations, getting my work clothes on and finding my gloves. I sat in the living room pulling my boots on when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I glanced up, the afternoon shadows just starting to lengthen, and saw a pair of small figures standing beside the road. I paused in mid-tie, looking up to see two small forms looking at the pile of dirt. It looked to be a couple of neighborhood kids, maybe having one last look before getting back to their game. I shook my head. Kids were so predictable. I finished tying my boots and stepped out onto the front porch. "Hey, looking's fine, but I don't want to see anyone in my..." The road was empty. I looked up and down the road. The kids were already playing a game of touch football further down the cul-de-sac. And I picked up my shovel as I thought about how strange that had been. Those two must have really been booking it to make it back to their playmates so quickly. As I started scooping dirt, I thought longingly about having that kind of energy. It would certainly make this job a lot easier. I spent the rest of the afternoon filling in gopher holes. It had been a particularly bad season for them, and the dirt was a band-aid solution at best. The gophers would continue to dig up my yard until I invested in a dog or something. I kept slinging dirt until the sun grew low in the sky, one angry chuck actually coming up to growl at me before I threw a shovelful of dirt in his face. When it became too dark to see, I thrust my shovel into the pile of dirt and shook the remaining dirt off myself. The kids were finishing up their football game, heading home as the streetlights came on. They all looked longingly at the pile of dirt, but they knew better than to make a play for it while I was standing on the front porch. My cigarette winked on and off as I stood watching the sun go down, and I pitched the end into the dirt as I went inside. I was frying up some hamburgers when I heard the first tremors of laughter from my front yard. Over the sound of popping grease, I could hear the scuttling laughter of children as they played out front. I walked over to the living room window and looked out into the front yard. By the streetlight's ghostly light, I could see them playing on the mound of dirt I had out front. There were 2 of them, both dressed in dirty jeans and colorful shirts, both having a ball as they capered on my pile of dirt. I was out the door in a matter of seconds, yelling before the door had fully opened. "Hey, just what the hell do you think you're doing? Can't you read? Stay off the..." The streetlights were dim, but even I could see the absence of anybody in my yard. I walked over to the pile, looking around to see if someone was hiding behind it. I saw pretty quickly that wasn't going to be the case. The pile of dirt was hardly 3 feet tall, and a kid would have to get pretty low to hide behind it. I glanced up and down the street, but the only thing moving on the road was an old chip bag pushed by the wind. I looked back at the pile and was shocked to find that I didn't even see any footprints. The wide, low dirt pile still looked fairly pristine, other than my shovel marks, of course. I scratched my head and went back inside. Maybe I'd just been working too hard today. I pulled my fries out of the oven just as they started to burn. I made 2 hamburgers and added them to the pile of french fries. I tipped a beer into a chilled glass and brought both to the table. After shoveling dirt all afternoon, I was tired and ready for a bite. As I lifted the first one from the plate, I heard my stomach grumble as the grease oozed off the meat. I had just taken the first bite when I heard the metal clang of my shovel falling over. I looked up to find those kids playing on my dirt again. I came barreling out the door, my dinner cooling on my plate, as I stormed out to send these kids off. I was becoming frustrated. I'd made it pretty clear that I didn't want people on my pile of dirt. I had been pretty nice about it, posting signs and asking the kids not to mess with it, but it appeared that some of these kids weren't getting it. If I needed to be a bastard to keep these kids off my dirt, I suppose I'd have to be a bastard. I'd barely gotten 2 words out of my mouth, though, before I once again noticed the yard was empty. I was really getting tired of this. I know what I saw, and what I saw was a pair of filthy kids on my pile of dirt. No matter how many times I checked the yard, though, there was never any sign of a trespasser. The strangest part was a distinct lack of footprints, though. The sand was fresh, maybe even a little damp when you got past the top layer. The kids had been jumping on the sand like a trampoline. There should have been footprints, handprints, something. They came back 3 more times that night, but the last is the only one that really stands out. That was the worst of their appearances. They appeared again as I was finishing my dishes, and again as I sat watching TV. I came striding out to holler at them both times, but all I found was an empty yard. This was ridiculous. What the hell was going on here? I know what I saw, but they were always gone the instant I came outside. Nobody could move that fast, especially not a couple of dirty little kids. And what the hell were they doing out after dark? Most of the parents on this block didn't let their kids out after the streetlights came on. Something funny was going on here. The last time I saw them, that night at least, was just before bedtime. I'd thought the pranks were over as time slipped on. It was 11 o'clock, and I was walking through the living room to get something to help me sleep. I was still a little on edge, and I thought that a nightcap might help me calm down a bit. I was coming out of the kitchen with a tumbler of whiskey, the curtains still open on the front yard, when I saw them there. My glass slipped out of my hand as the 2 kids stood crouching on top of my dirt pile. I was speechless for a moment as the angry fire built inside me. I was furious. Who the hell did these kids think they were? They were coming up in the middle of the night trying to mess with me. But why? I'd made a very simple request. Why were these kids tormenting me? Because I wouldn't let them play on my damn dirt pile? If I had stopped to quell my anger, I might have noticed that something wasn't right with these 2. The night air was cool on my bare chest as I came shambling out of my house like an angry bull. Who the hell do you think you are? It's almost midnight. Get your asses over here right now. I'm going to call your parents and let them know what you've been up to. I got a good mind to... They hadn't moved this time, though. They just stood on that mound of dirt like 2 scrawny scarecrows, glowering at me through the dirt caked over their face. My God, had they been eating the dirt or something? I had thought them filthy, but these kids were downright grimy. They didn't seem at all concerned with me, but I definitely had their full attention. I'd come half into the yard when I saw their eyes. They both seemed to have a nasty case of red eye. They stared at me, their eyes seeming to glow somehow, and I suddenly noticed that they cast no shadow in the dim streetlight. They should have. The dirt pile and my shovel cast a long gantry into the falling streetlight, but these two had nothing. I had stopped barely 20 feet from the pair when the larger of the two took a step towards me. When his dirty sneakers gritted against the loose earth, the red piping looked faded beneath all that mud, and I saw the earth drop over it like a hand. He opened his mouth, trying to say something, but all that came out was wet soil. Sand and mud bubbled out from over his lips, and the dirt that had covered his foot had begun to slide up his leg as well. He fell to his knees, clutching his throat as he coughed up leaves and mud as well. The sand slid over his hands and up his arms. Even as the dirt bound the first boy to the pile by his knees, they both struggled, trying to free themselves from the prison of sand, but their efforts were ultimately in vain. The sand reclaimed them both in a sudden whoosh. In a blink, they were both gone again. I walked backwards, never taking my eyes off that pile, until the door was closed between us. The next day, I set to work early. I wanted that pile of dirt out of my yard before nightfall. I worked diligently, filling in holes and putting dirt to good use. I used it to fill in a few of the potholes in front of my house even. I just wanted as much of it gone as I could manage. I no longer cared how it happened. When the kids came by on their bikes, I told them to leave. They seemed disappointed, but I didn't want them anywhere near that dirt pile. I was filling in an exceptionally large gopher hole when something caught my eye. I had nearly turned back to the pile when something pale and long made me take a second look. At first I thought it was a worm, but the more I looked, the more I thought I knew what it was. I bent down, the shovel hitting the ground woodenly, as I reached down to pick up what I hoped was a bleached piece of wood. It wasn't, though. It was cold, malleable if not unmovable, and crooked like a sea of pale, purpling flesh. The perfectly filthy nail was hardly visible at the tip of the small finger. I went back to the pile and saw the rest of the hand poking out from the bottom, minus the finger I had accidentally amputated. The cops came when I called, and they brought dogs with them as well as the big white forensics van. They excavated the bodies of a 10-year-old boy from the bottom of the dirt pile, his face frozen in a look of terrified disbelief. He was dressed in very dirty, if not very familiar clothes, and his sneakers had that same filthy red piping that I'd seen the night before. When they lifted him free, they found that his hand was intertwined with something else that also came loose. The other boy had been about 8, and the two had died hand in hand, it seemed. The police had wanted to arrest me, or at least bring me in for questioning, but the forensics guys had figured out pretty quick that these kids had been dead for the last month. A quick search determined that they had been on the missing persons roster for about 3 weeks, and their parents had feared they'd been abducted by some pervert. They'd been playing near the sand pits before they'd gone missing, and the coroner would later find dirt and mud in their lungs and mouth. He figured they had been climbing the big sand piles out there, piles just waiting to be scooped into a truck and sold as fill dirt, when one of them had been sucked down by a pocket of air or an empty spot in the pile. His brother had tried to help him and ended up getting pulled down as well. The two had suffocated as they tried to get out and been picked up by the fill dirt as they trucked it to the company I had bought it from. It happens sometimes, the coroner had told me when I'd asked about it a few weeks later. Kids never think about that kind of thing. They just see a big pile of dirt and start climbing. I haven't seen the two since they took the bodies away, and the company I bought it from came and got the rest of it before they gave me a full refund. I hope they find peace wherever they are now. I think, from now on, I'll just hire someone to fill the holes in my yard. I don't ever want to see another pile of dirt for as long as I live.
One last story for you, and I think I've got a pretty good example saved for last. It's a story about a man in the one place you expect to feel safe, where you expect to feel comfortable, the bathroom. Every one of us expects a little bit of privacy in the bathroom, but what happens when that privacy is taken away from us? Well, sounds like then we too might get caught with our pants down.
I've worked construction since dropping out of high school. So about 20 years. I know most people don't think much of it, but if you haven't shivered in the night lately, then thank a construction worker, because we probably built the thing that's keeping the elements out. It's not glamorous work, but I've managed to claw my way up the ranks till I've got my own crew, run my own job sites, and live pretty comfortably. After 20 years, I've noticed that there are constants in this industry, but only 3 standouts: hard hats, lunch pails, and porta-johns. Job sites and porta-johns go together like, well, hand in glove. They're always necessary, always terrible to get stuck in for long periods of time, and always seem to smell both sterile and like a horse manure field. In 20 years, I've been inside more porta-johns than I have women, and unfortunately, I think some of them were cleaner. This particular time was a little different. A lot different. And it's something that sticks with me to this day. It's been weeks, months even, and I still wake up sometimes in a cold sweat as I see that thing and hear it grind its teeth together. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. We were working on these new apartments, one of those big old buildings with about 8 units per floor and about 15 floors that are wedged between one another. One that's mostly the same thing. I was sipping my 5th cup of coffee when I heard the ominous rumble from my guts and knew what was coming. I'd had 2 breakfast burritos from Dolly's. She's an angel, but she goes heavy on the pepper. A whole pot of coffee, a hash brown as big as a pretzel, and now it was all coming to a head. The guy showing me the blueprints for the building looked at me with real worry and asked if I needed to take a minute. I told him I was fine, but he got about halfway through telling me about a problem with the wiring when it happened again. I gritted my teeth. That one might as well have been a starting pistol, and I told him I'd be right back. I made it to the lift just before the doors closed, and the guy who was taking it down looked worried as my stomach growled like a V8 with a bad carburetor. "Too many Dolly spicy chorizos, boss?" he said, and I nodded as the sweat started to stand out. "It's fighting with the pot of coffee and the hash brown in there, and it's anybody's bet who's gonna win. Remind me not to follow you into the John," he said with a laugh as the lift came to the ground floor. I was out and looking for one of the blue boxes that marked our porta potties. There were about 5 of them on the site, and wasn't long before I found one over by the office. I was waddling now, trying not to lose it right here in the yard, and the guys were laughing as I came ponderously towards my oasis in the desert. I closed the door, pushed the black locking bar into place, and had my pants down and my ass over the hole before I could embarrass myself any further. I checked for paper and was glad to find some, not always a given, and as the pressure began to relieve itself in the worst possible way, I closed my eyes and sighed happily. I'll save you the messy details, but needless to say, I was glad when it was finally over. I took out my phone, giving it some time to see if there was any more business to conduct. And that's when I became aware of the strange sound. First, I thought I might not be done, but I realized pretty quick that the slight splashing noise wasn't me. It was like something was making ripples in the water, splashing up a little as it stirred below, and I wondered if maybe I had dropped off a big enough payload to still be stirring in the tank. When it splashed again, this one high enough to wet my nethers with cold, dirty water, I stood up quickly. That had definitely been something alive splashing around in there, and I must have looked pretty silly just standing there, pants around ankles, as I stared into the hole. I fumbled at my phone, trying not to drop it in as well, and bent low so I could see into the fallow pit. was hard to tell at first. The murky blue water looked like a subterranean lake more than anything, and the lighting inside wasn't helping matters in the least bit. I wondered if a snake had gotten in, maybe something bigger, and that was when I noticed something round coming out of the water. As it rose, I recognized it for what it was, the top of a very bald head. The tips of ears were sticking up from the surface of the muck, and as it rose, I could see the beginnings of eyes as well. They were open, staring, utterly devoid of anything human. I stumbled back, nearly falling down as my feet tangled in my pants, and bumped hard against the door as the whole edifice shook on its base. What the hell was that, I wondered? Had some homeless guy gotten into our shitter? Had some freak gotten down there with nasty stuff on his mind? I didn't know, but what I did know was that I was locked in here with him. I reached for the lock, the light from my phone held forward so I could see, and when I heard a splash, I turned back in a hurry. The light from my phone fell across the opening, and the head that rose from it looked like some kind of creature from one of those old stories my friends and I had told to spook each other when we were young. Its skin was inky, though that could have had more to do with where he was residing. Its ears were long and pointed like a bat, and its eyes were white like a full moon. It rose from the festering swamp like a vampire from an old movie, its body simply rising without any mechanism to lift it. I wasn't sure if it was tall or capable of levitation or something, but its face came fully over the lip of the toilet lid. I saw the worst of it then. Its mouth was stretched into a perpetual grin, the teeth long and sharp as they fit together like puzzle pieces. As neatly as they came together, they still appeared to be too long for its mouth. They looked like they might be painful to it, the grin more of a grimace than anything. And they were gravel gray and slimy with something more viscous than saliva. In the dim light of the little toilet, it rose up to tower over me. It kept rising, its head nearly brushing the ceiling, and I could see that its arms and legs were indeed longer than expected. They were nearly twice as long as its body, the hands ending in cruel claws. It leered at me, reveling in my fear, and I was paralyzed by it. The creature was terrifying, but I don't think that was all of it. There's certain places where you seem to believe that there's an illusion of safety. Your home, your bed, your bathroom, places you're at your most vulnerable and comfortable. You think of these places as safe, like sanctuaries, and when these places are violated, it feels like a violation of your person. It opened its mouth, giving me a good look at those gravel gray fangs, and as it hissed softly, it leaned forward like it was getting ready to strike. I don't know how I did it. I shouldn't have been able to move at all, but my hand seemed to come up all on its own and flick the plastic bar back that was holding the door closed. I went from cowering on the floor of a filthy porta-potty to scrambling across the yard of the job site, the light flooding in as it sent the creature shrinking back into that dark hole. I had crab-walked about 20 feet when I realized that I hadn't had time to pull my pants up, and I was scrambling half naked across a job site with hundreds of people on it. I didn't think all of them were watching me, but that was way more eyes than I wanted there to be. I jerked my pants up, started yelling about some kind of animal being in the porta-potty. Some of the guys ran over to investigate. Others came to see if I was okay, but Ultimately, they didn't find nothing. I told the authorities when they got there too, that something had been in the tank, and it had come at me, spitting mad. They got somebody out there to drain it, but they didn't find nothing. I hadn't expected they would. Whatever it was, it had gone back to hiding in the muck. I had the unit closed down and told the vendor that he could come and get it. He offered to bring me a new one, but I didn't help. I do my business off-site now, but I'll remember that grinning, dripping, terrible face for as long as I live.
And just like that, our tales are at an end for another day. I do hope you'll join us next time for more cozy horror with me, Dr. Plague. Until then, I hope you'll have a wonderful day and a spooky evening.